Welcome back to Emma Crossdressing, where we celebrate real videos of courage, discovery, and the beauty of becoming your true self.
Object of your affection. Give me all your time, touch, money, and
The hardest person to face was never the stranger staring at me. It was the reflection waiting for me every morning. For years, my bedroom mirror became my greatest enemy and my greatest secret at the same time. I would walk past it pretending it didn't exist, yet every evening I found myself standing in front of it, wondering who I was trying so hard to protect. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was trying to stop hiding. The first time I carefully put together a feminine outfit, my hands trembled so much that I almost dropped the blouse before I even slipped it on. It wasn't expensive. Nothing about it was glamorous. Just a simple cardigan, a soft skirt, and a pair of flats I had spent weeks convincing myself to buy. When I finally looked into the mirror, I didn't see perfection. I saw honesty. That frightened me more than anything. I quickly changed back into my usual clothes, folded everything neatly, and hid the outfit inside an old storage box beneath blankets that no one ever touched. Closing the lid felt like locking away a part of myself. For months, that became my routine. Unlock the box. Become myself. Lock it again. Every click of the lid sounded like a promise that tomorrow would somehow be easier. It never was. Outside my room, conversations about people who dressed differently always carried an edge. Sometimes it came as laughter. Sometimes as careless jokes. Sometimes as silence that somehow hurt even more. I smiled along. Inside, every word stayed with me. Eventually, I realized something important. People weren't judging me. They were judging an imaginary version of me that existed only in their assumptions. That thought became the beginning of the first lesson I would eventually learn. The first way to overcome judgment is to stop assuming everyone is thinking about you. I know that sounds impossible because I didn't believe it either. One afternoon I decided to test myself. Instead of hiding completely, I wore a soft lavender sweater underneath my jacket. No one could really tell. It wasn't dramatic. Simply felt more like me. As I walked through the grocery store, my heart pounded so loudly I thought people could hear it. Every person passing by felt like a judge. Every glance felt like a verdict. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl smiled at me because I accidentally helped her pick up a box of cereal she had dropped. An older man held the door open. A cashier asked how my day was going. Nobody looked shocked. Nobody whispered. Nobody pointed. I drove home almost confused. My own fear had been louder than reality. That evening I stood before the mirror again. For the first time I didn't criticize every detail. Instead, I asked a different question. What if confidence isn't something people give me? What if it's something I practice? The mirror remained silent. But somehow it didn't feel cold anymore. Over the next several weeks I stopped chasing perfection. Instead of trying to look flawless, I focused on feeling comfortable. Maybe the cardigan wasn't perfectly matched. Maybe my makeup needed practice. Maybe my hairstyle wasn't exactly how I imagined. None of that mattered. Because each tiny improvement wasn't about impressing strangers. It was proof that I hadn't given up on myself. Still, fear has a strange way of returning when you least expect it. One rainy afternoon, while leaving a bookstore carrying a novel I'd been excited to read, I noticed two teenagers glance in my direction before quietly laughing. I immediately assumed I knew why. Heat rushed into my face. Every old insecurity came flooding back. Without thinking, I turned around and hurried to my car, my confidence collapsing in seconds. As I sat behind the steering wheel, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. There it was again. The mirror. Always waiting. Always asking the same silent question. Whose opinion are you carrying today? I couldn't answer. Not yet. Because I was about to learn that overcoming judgment isn't only about strangers. Sometimes the loudest criticism comes from the voice inside your own head. I sat in that parked car for nearly 20 minutes, listening to the rain tap against the windshield like tiny questions I couldn't avoid. The bookstore disappeared behind a curtain of water, yet my thoughts stayed trapped on those two teenagers. I had already written an entire story in my head. They laughed because of me. They noticed something. They were judging me. Then I caught myself. I had no proof. Just fear. That realization didn't erase the sting, but it slowed it down enough for me to breathe. Before starting the engine, I looked into the rearview mirror once more. It reflected the same face I had seen hundreds of times, but this time I whispered something I had never dared to say aloud. You don't have to earn the right to be yourself. The words sounded unfamiliar, almost borrowed. Still, hearing them changed something. That became the second lesson I learned. The second way to overcome judgment is to replace your inner critic with your own encouragement. For years, my internal voice had been harsher than anyone I'd ever met. Every small mistake became evidence that I wasn't confident enough, polished enough, or brave enough. I realized that even if the whole world accepted me, none of it would matter if I couldn't accept myself. So I started changing small habits. Every morning, instead of immediately searching for flaws in the mirror, I looked for one thing I genuinely appreciated. Sometimes it was as simple as standing a little taller. Sometimes it was the color I had chosen to wear. Sometimes it was just the fact that I hadn't hidden away. Those tiny victories began to add up. The mirror, once a symbol of fear, slowly became a reminder of progress. Not perfection. Progress. A few weeks later, I gathered enough courage to attend a local creative arts exhibition. People from all walks of life filled the gallery. Painters, photographers, musicians, students. Everyone seemed absorbed in the artwork. I almost turned around before walking inside. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But I remembered something. No one there knew my story. And maybe that was a gift. As I wandered through the gallery, I paused in front of a painting of a cracked mirror stitched together with golden lines. The artist had written a short sentence beside it. Broken reflections can still reveal the truth. I stood there much longer than I expected. Felt strangely personal. An elderly woman beside me smiled and said, "Beautiful, isn't it?" I nodded. "It reminds me that imperfections tell better stories," she added before continuing on her way. She had no idea how deeply those words landed. She wasn't commenting on my appearance. She wasn't analyzing me. She was simply sharing what the painting meant to her. Again, my assumptions had been louder than reality. That afternoon became one of the happiest days I'd experienced in years. Not because something extraordinary happened, but because nothing terrible happened. I laughed. I explored. I existed. Without apologizing. Not every day was that easy. There were still mornings when I questioned everything. Days when I wondered if hiding would simply make life less complicated. During those moments, I returned to the same mirror and asked myself a different question. If someone I loved felt this fear, what would I tell them? The answer was always kinder than anything I said to myself. So I began offering that same kindness inward. Soon after, another challenge arrived. A coworker noticed I seemed more confident lately and casually asked, "You seem different somehow. New hobby?" For a split second, panic returned. I could have laughed it off. I could have changed the subject. Instead, I simply smiled. I've been spending more time figuring out who I am. It wasn't a dramatic confession. It was an honest sentence. To my surprise, they nodded and replied, "That's something most people never make time for." The conversation moved on. No awkward silence. No judgment. Just understanding. That moment taught me the third lesson. The third way to overcome judgment is to remember that authenticity often invites respect, even if it doesn't invite agreement. Not everyone would understand my journey, and that was okay. Understanding isn't a requirement for kindness. As autumn arrived, the storage box under my bed remained untouched. Not because I had stopped expressing myself, but because I no longer needed to hide everything inside it. The clothes that once represented secrecy had become symbols of courage, and the mirror that once reflected fear now reflected possibility. Still, the greatest test of my confidence was waiting just around the corner. A moment that would force me to choose between retreating into the shadows or finally stepping into the light without looking back. The invitation sat on my desk for 3 days before I opened it. It was for a community creativity fair. A place where people shared art, music, photography, handmade crafts, and personal stories. One section even encouraged visitors to come dressed in a way that expressed their individuality. For most people, it probably sounded like a fun weekend. For me, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. Every excuse found its way into my mind. Maybe next year. Maybe I'm not ready. Maybe people will stare. Then my eyes drifted toward the mirror across the room. It had become more than a piece of glass. It had become a quiet companion, reminding me of every step I had already taken. It reflected the person who had hidden outfits in a storage box, the person who had once believed every stranger was silently judging them, and the person who had learned to replace fear with honesty. I smiled at my reflection. Not because every insecurity had disappeared. Because they hadn't. I smiled because I had stopped letting those insecurities make every decision. The morning of the event arrived with clear skies and a nervous heartbeat. I chose an outfit that felt true to me. Simple, elegant, and comfortable. A soft blouse, a flowing cardigan, dark jeans, and a pair of flats that had become my favorite. Nothing flashy. Nothing designed to shock. Just me. As I locked my front door, I realized something unusual. For the first time, I hadn't looked back to make sure no one had seen me leave. That tiny change meant more than I could explain. The venue buzzed with conversations, laughter, and music. Artists proudly stood beside their work. Families wandered through colorful displays. Friends posed for photographs. For a moment I froze. Old fears whispered that I didn't belong. Then another voice, one I had carefully built over the past months, answered back. You belong anywhere you can be honest. I took one step, then another. The anxiety didn't vanish. It simply stopped leading the way. Throughout the afternoon, I met people with incredible stories. One woman had started painting after retiring. A young man proudly displayed clothes he had designed himself. Another visitor spoke about overcoming years of self-doubt before finally pursuing the career they truly wanted. None of our journeys were identical, but they all shared one thing: the courage to stop living entirely for someone else's expectations. Later that day, a teenager approached me while looking at a photography exhibit. I like your style, they said with a warm smile. You look comfortable. Comfortable. Of all the compliments I had imagined receiving, that one stayed with me the longest. Not pretty. Not fashionable. Comfortable. Because that was exactly what I had been searching for all along. As the event came to an end, I caught my reflection in one of the gallery windows. The evening sun painted everything in warm gold, and for a second, the glass looked just like the mirror back home. I realized it wasn't the mirror that had changed. I had. That final realization brought me to the fourth lesson. The fourth way to overcome judgment is to find people who celebrate authenticity instead of demanding perfection. You cannot control every opinion, but you can choose whose voices deserve a place in your life. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will make assumptions. Some may never see beyond their first impression. Their opinions belong to them. Your life belongs to you. As I walked home that evening, one final lesson quietly settled into my heart. The fifth way to overcome judgment is to measure your growth by your courage, not by other people's approval. Approval fades. Trends change. Opinions shift. But every time you choose honesty over fear, you build something that lasts. Confidence isn't waking up one morning without doubts. It's learning to walk forward while carrying them. When I reached home, I stood in front of the same mirror that had witnessed every chapter of my journey. The storage box beneath my bed was still there, but it no longer represented secrecy. It represented where my story began. The mirror no longer asked, "Whose opinion are you carrying today?" Now it seemed to ask something entirely different. How far have you come? This time I knew the answer. Far enough to stop hiding. Far enough to smile at my own reflection. Far enough to understand that confidence isn't the absence of judgment. It is the quiet decision to remain yourself despite it. And as I turned off the light and walked away from the mirror, I realized I wasn't leaving a secret behind anymore.